8 hours. Yes, we're recording. So welcome everybody. Warm greetings from a very warm Turku, Finland. I'm David Yokin. I think we all know you know me, that's for sure. So I'll skip my own introduction. But anyway, this is the Cape Network's fourth and concluding webinar this spring 2021. And I think this has been a really great way to go forward in these times where we can't meet. And the really wonderful thing is that we have a large archive now of these presentations, which have been quite diverse. Before we go to our afternoon focus, I do want to bring up a little bit of some items that I'd like to share with you. One is, let me just get that up. Yeah. We've established the Cape Advisory Board and have already met, and I want to thank Tina, Charlotte, and Saule for their time in discussing ways that we can go forward. We have a proposal that our main action will be something that happens in January or February 2022. And the main thing is I've kind of reached out to everybody. We really would need 4 student representatives to be on this board, especially in the context of the February event. We're wanting to create a workshop that is very student-centered, co-created, with ideas and themes coming from students that are of interest and of importance for them. And we can only do that if we can have some student representatives. So I will once again throw that out there, and students can certainly contact me. And it's not a heavy lift, it's a light load, but it is having the voice of the students. That's one item. Then I would like to just share with you, let me pull that up 1 second. Yep. Something is not happening here. Give me just 1 second. Yes, I'd like to share with you that already for the fall, because we want to continue this monthly webinar gathering, I've been working with a very close colleague now, Simon Bradley, and also Anna Wendy Stevenson, both artists, musicians from the University of Highlands and Islands in Scotland. And Simon is the program leader of the master's degree in music and the environment, which is a really engaging master's level course that goes beyond just the kind of terminology of environment as far as a physical space, but really brings students and staff, faculty into a real community engagement with what environment means. And I think that he will have a really wonderful context of how they're approaching that in Scotland, and also the long-term, distant, blended hybrid teaching that they've been doing there, because I believe there are, what did they tell me, there are 52 campuses. There is a huge network of physical spaces that comprise the University of Highlands and Islands, and actually way before COVID, they were very focused on developing meaningful online experiences for these teachers and students. So those are 2 ideas. And then reaching out to the network, I'm really looking forward to some other ideas that would be for September, for October, November, and December's webinar possibilities. That's a little bit of the house cleaning. Wanted to start with that. But now I'm going to turn it over to our colleague, Dr. Rasmus Ölme, and I just want to say it's a privilege and an honor that we can end the spring webinar series with Rasmus, who has a prodigious and very deep background as an artist, as a performer, affiliated with some of our time's leading artists himself, and also that he acts today as the professor and head of program for the BFA in Dance and Choreography and the newly started MFA in Choreography at the National Danish School of Performing Arts in Copenhagen. So without further ado, I turn things over to Rasmus. Thank you so much, Rasmus.
Thanks, David. And hello, everyone. Nice to see you. Thanks for taking time to join this. I can start by saying that I was hoping to do this webinar from school in Copenhagen. I live in Stockholm and I usually commute every second week. I managed to, I was supposed to travel down there yesterday and managed to twist my ankle and couldn't travel yesterday. So I'm still at home and I'm catching a train later this afternoon. So my ankle is fine, but I couldn't travel yesterday. So instead of being able to come to you from one of the studios in Copenhagen that I was hoping to do, I'm instead coming to you from my living room in Stockholm. So I was hoping to be able to show a little bit of the space at the school as well, but instead this is the space I'm in. And as you will see during the presentation here, space does matter. So thanks, David, for the invitation here. And I came in a bit late to the Cape Network, but when I saw the topics, I wanted to propose this talk since it does deal with environment, but maybe not so much from the political or social point of view, but from an artistic point of view of what it means to sort of engage in one's environment. So what I'm talking to you about, and it's said already a little bit here in the title, and so it's a project that it reaches back a few years already. But I've just recently received a grant for a pilot version of this research project that I'm trying to turn into a little bit of a larger research project in Denmark. And so I'm going to tell you, we're just starting this, but as I said, it reaches back in time a little bit through previous projects. You know how an idea comes to life. It's usually generated from previous ideas and so. I wanted to share my screen. I guess I can do that, David. I have a little bit of a PowerPoint here that I would think that I'll be talking through. You probably can see my face at the side of it, but I might like go in and out of the sharing so that you don't need to watch this all the time. So I'm going to step right to the beginning. Sorry, I started on the wrong here. So this is just the introduction here, where we are at, and the title here, Dancing on the Threshold Between Body and Place, a presentation of my current research interests. David already kindly gave a little introduction, and my bio was also in the email, so I don't think I need to introduce myself, to spend more time instead talking about the project and eventually also talking to you with the questions that you might have. So I'm going to give you first a backdrop of the project. Like I said, it reaches a bit into previous projects and previous ideas. So as you can see here, the first, it says a Swedish title here, Försvinna hur, and that is sort of translated as to how to disappear. Literally, it would mean disappear how. And it was a series of site-specific choreographic works that I did in Uppsala in 2015 to 2018. And I was collaborating with a group, a research group that I founded during the PhD that I did in Stockholm at Uniarts. And the group, it calls itself The Swarm. So in Uppsala, what this was an invitation from the region of Uppsala. And we did, I think, 4 of these different interactions or presentations. And it was always then with a proposed site. So this picture that you see on the slide here is from what's called Uppsala Congress and Concert. And the back of the head there is an audience member, but the 3 persons moving are 3 members of the swarm. So you see here at the right of the slide, I have a couple of bullet points to talk you through what we're up to in this work. So one thing is this, what I call a choreographic perspective. And what I mean with that is that, things can be considered choreographic, although they're not necessarily thought of as choreography when someone made them. So you imagine you go down and you put yourself in front of a busy square somewhere, or like a crossing in traffic, and you see how the sort of crowd control is organized through different signs. You know, there might be a red light or some lines in the street, the zebra crossing or whatever it could be. Maybe there's a tram. You know, that there are some different categories that needs to find a system to function in. And you could look at that crossing there from a choreographic perspective and see how movement is organized in that space. It doesn't mean that there was a choreographer involved in making that little performance, but I can choose to look at it choreographically, and somehow I then sort of performatively turn this situation into a choreographic situation. So that means that there is a kind of intention in looking at something from a choreographic point of view. And I would say that this choreographic point of view is a kind of analysis of what I then call, in the second bullet point there, choreographic agents. And what I mean by that is, like, what are the sort of elements that form the choreography of that place? So if we can look at the image there, you know, there are these 3 floors that sort of lend themselves to this picture, or I mean, for us to move in them at the same time, because that's somehow already proposed in the scenography of that site. So on one hand, it's that kind of like, okay, visually what is proposed as places where one can be, and then what you don't see here, but there's a little bit on the right side, you see that there's a diagonal in the right corner up there, which is a really tall escalator that moves up 4 floors. And what you don't see is that there's another one going down here as well. So there are these really tall, long escalators reaching through the entire building that we also use them. So they were kind of more comparable to what I said about like crowd control, no? Like what access or accessibility to movement is available in this place. Using the elevators as well to go sort of backstage to be able to change between the different, so you could go out, you know, could exit in one floor and then take the elevator, or run quickly up the stairs that are sort of backstage and appear at another level, which sort of gave this kind of almost slapstick, you know, disappearance and reappearing in the environment. So the choreographic agents is something that is, like I said, something that I feel acts, so agent in that sense that it has agency on the choreographic perspectives in a space. So looking at a site from this choreographic perspective is doing this analysis of these agents to see how we're in there. And then the last point there, moving and being moved. So that there is a kind of a mutual meeting between how I move in the space and how the space moves me. No, in the sense, I mean, in the escalators, it's obvious. It's literally the space that can move me. No, like I don't even need to move. I can travel without moving in that space. But also in just sort of how it proposes itself to me, it's already moving me. Like it suggests for me how I should move there. So there is some kind of a command. I know the famous American choreographer William Forsythe has spoken of choreography as an art of command. I don't know if I agree about that, because I think it's a little bit of a negotiation in this command, and that's why I have this mutual moving and being moved. Because of course you can try to challenge the way that the space proposes you to move. One beautiful example of that is parkour. You know, this urban environmental practices of people finding ways to move through the city that you didn't really understand that was possible, no? And I know that this appeared in France, and the original title of these people were traceurs, which trace is to make it, draw a line. So someone who draws a line, no? So you can see like how you're able to draw a sort of unexpected line through the environment, the line that wasn't there before. So these are a little bit the ideas that this moving and being moved, this mutual engagement between me and the space, that laid as a background. Now the title, maybe I should say something about that, how to disappear. Because in this engagement with an environment, I experienced a sort of disappearance. And so rather than me appearing in that space and making myself visible, I also feel that I somehow disappear into that space. And I don't mean it in the sense of like that you can't see me, but more of an experience of sort of blending into the space. So while I'm engaging with the space, there is a kind of becoming space in my experience. So it's not disappear. I mean, the how, the question there, disappear how, is maybe the question there, meaning like it's not just about hiding yourself in the environment, but an other form of disappearance into the space. All right, I'm going to move on. So this brings us to camouflage, and this picture here is just something I found online. Someone that accidentally blends into the space. You see how her top fits exactly the hotel corridor there. And you see her surprised look. So this is not, it wasn't someone who, I guess, like I said, I don't know exactly the source of this picture, but it's not someone who was aiming to blend into that space, but apparently there was some kind of unconscious agreement there. So the quote I have here beneath, I'm going to read it through, although you can read it yourself. Mimetic behavior as a product of a non-intentional reflex. Blending into the background, he contends, this is Roger Caillois speaking, is a living creature's spontaneous aesthetic response to the temptation of or attraction to space. So the reason I bring this up then is because, when I said before the disappearing, so camouflage we usually understand as a creature's capacity to blend into its own environment. But what is proposed here then, is that it's not necessarily this evolutionary explanation that a prey could hide from its predator by disappearing into the surrounding. But there is also something else that would be this non-intentional. So not intentional, I mean, evolution has at least the intention of survival, right? So of the creature. But this instead that it would be a spontaneous, and I love this, aesthetic response. So instead of an evolutionary response, it's a kind of aesthetic response to the environment. And that there is a temptation then in the space, or an attraction to. So that could give an idea about how that disappearance is somehow following this temptation or this attraction to blend into space. So scientifically, there are also people who question a little bit the evolutionary explanation to camouflage simply by noticing that it doesn't always work. Take examples of a prey that fits well into the colors of its environment, but then its predator, the animal that it will most likely be eaten by, is colorblind. So it doesn't really address the problem. So instead, it could be this aesthetic response. So another picture and another quote. You need to look at this picture a little bit closer, but maybe you can see that there is a man in there among all the phones. One can sort of see a silhouette. And the man in the picture is a Chinese artist called Liu Bulin. And he does this of painting himself into different environments. So you can find lots of amazing pictures of him just sort of placing himself in a grocery store or something and disappearing among the products there. Now, the quote, I'll read this one out loud as well. So, to be a body is to be tied to a certain world. Our body is not primarily in space, it is of it. So this experienced separation between body and space that of course we need. We want to be able to situate ourselves in relation to our environment. So we perceive the space from a place where we are. However, there is our perception of space is of course dictated or generated, one could even say, by our perceptual apparatus. So I can only see what my eyes are able to see. If I would have a X-ray vision or something like that, or gamma vision, the world would look very differently. So, but the visual capacities that I have, the sort of prism of colors that my eyes allow me to recognize. So that means when I'm watching something here in my room and I see a yellow pot, I'm stating the obvious a little bit here, but the pot is not yellow. It's a kind of rendering that my perceptual system does for me. So in that sense, what we are looking at when we're looking out from the body into the environment is a sort of extension of our own body. It's the capacities, the perceptual capacities that my body has, that then renders this image back to me, so that I experience the space the way I do. So there's quite a lot of scientific and also philosophical works around this. Maybe like some that can be worth mentioning is Jakob Uxkull, who was a biologist already, I believe, in the 17th century, and he was German, and he had this term of Umwelt, or surrounding or environment, that he was working with. And there is also an American philosopher called Douglas Gibson, I believe, who worked much later, though, but in the 19th century or 20th century even, on this, the relation between an animal and its environment. So you can imagine that you're sitting in, let's say that we take the example of an animal that is quite close to us, like a pet, a cat. Let's say you have a cat at home. And when you're sitting in the sofa with that cat, you're finding yourself, you're both sharing the same physical world, but you're not sharing environment, because the cat's environment appears to the cat in a very different way than your environment appears to you. So although you're sharing the physical world, you're not really sharing the environment, as you are different species that will produce different environments for yourself. And then, of course, we can also speak about differences within between us human. It's not that we all perceive reality in the same way either. Although we would, I'm not just talking about possible variations to functionalities, someone like being colorblind or having other abilities to move or move less. But also just on a more personal level, or what kind of experiences you have. What makes you look at the place in a certain way in relation to your own memories of that place, for example. So me going back to visit the house where you grew up is, of course, not the same environment as it is for you. So, but then what I'm interested in here is this threshold. So you see the top of the new slide here, a threshold, an interface, and then comes another Swedish title, which is the title of this pilot project I'm doing now, Utifrån utåt. It's not that easily translatable into English, but utifrån means like from outside, and then utåt means from inside and out. So usually you would say utifrån and in, so like from outwards and in, or the opposite, from inside and out. But this from outside and out is some kind of this, if we think about the camouflage there, so when the creature blends into its environment, it is somehow blending into the outside, and it's projecting that outside back onto the outside. So an animal that catches the features of its environment is somehow projecting the outside onto the outside that makes any sense. Almost like a mirror, no? Like mirroring something back to itself. So I'm going to discuss a couple of these thresholds that the project addresses. So the first one is this body and space. And of course, it's what I've been talking about now, that there is a kind of interface between the body and the environment where they both blur. So the space is a part of me, and I'm a part of the space, that like the quote there from Merleau-Ponty, like I'm of space rather than in space. There was an example by a colleague, a former colleague of mine, who mentioned as an example that a beaver, that their capacity to make trees fall into a river as a way to stop the flow and create a little pond. And it's because it's easier for them to, it's better for their environment. The pond is a better place for them to be in. So they're kind of building a little house for themselves. So, and then he asked this sort of rhetorical question. So the pond there, is it a part of the beaver or a part of the nature? So it's somehow an extension of the beaver into the surrounding. And of course, in our case, in this era that sometimes is proposed to be called the Anthropocene. I don't know if you're familiar with that expression. So anthro as being human, that we're now living in this era where it's the human that has the largest effect on its own environment. So rather than being left to the chaos, we're creating another chaos for ourselves. So, and in our cases, we can, I'm sure you notice this in your own life, it's very rare that we get in contact with something that is not built by us for us. I will live in an apartment, or even when I go out in outside my home, or even when I leave the city, I will mostly maybe use a bike, or I will stay on a road that was made for that, or I'll sit on a bench somewhere. So the little paths that have been created for us to visit nature, but it's quite rare that we put our feet into a pristine nature. Even if we go hiking, we're usually following some trails that are meant for us to hike on. So we are somehow, this, like a tank, that doesn't need to have road, because it brings the road with it, right? It has these rolling wheels that sort of creates the road for the wheels to roll on. And somehow we're doing something similar, like we're bringing our own environment with us when we walk into the nature somehow, and keep stepping on something that we have created to step on. So this in between there, like this example of the beaver, or now other examples of us, a human, that creates this interface between body and space. So as a continuation there, I'm writing from impression to expression. And this is somehow the methodology or technique that we are working with when we are blending in, using movement to blend in. Like I said, this moving and being moved. So when I experience a space, a place, it comes to me as an impression of that. And now if I have this idea that I'm going to sort of reflect it back onto itself, it becomes an expression instead. So my impression of that site is then sort of projected onto the site through my movement. So hence the title utifrån utåt, like from outside and outwards, as a kind of reflecting back of my own impressions into an expression towards the space. The next threshold here, and I can maybe say something first about like why I also use the word interface. There's oh now I lost his name. I can see if it comes back to me. He's written a book called The Case Against Reality, and he is more of a neuroscientist, and talking about how how we perceive the world is not an exact, it's a rendering. It's this perceptual capacities that I've been explaining. But when he makes this case, the case against reality, he uses this metaphor of an interface. So like the one that you are looking at now, right? You're looking at the digital interface of me talking to you. So, and he says that when we're interacting with the screen, and I think he uses the example of throwing something in the waste bin, for example. So you can drag and drop, you pick something up on your desktop on the screen, you drag it over to the trash bin and you drop it there. And this is a kind of functional rendering of that we can understand, like taking something and throwing it somewhere. But of course, on a digital level, on coding, there is no trash can in your computer, and there is nothing that's being dragged inside the computer from one place to another. This is just a rendering that is functional. And his case against reality is that the reality is just a functional rendering. So when you're looking and you're taking a paper and you're throwing it in the waste bin, not on the screen, but actually in your living room or wherever you are, it's also a kind of rendering of, it's not to say that there is no such thing as a waste bin and paper, but even the fact that you see the waste bin as a place to throw the paper, it means that this has a kind of function that is tied into its form. So it renders itself to you with this functionality already. So if we would think of this interface between me and the environment as a functional one, it could also maybe be drawn back then to when I mentioned parkour, like what kind of function can I find in this space? What can I see as possible to do? And I think that could be a good example of this, like a moving and being moved, right? This choreographic perspective. So I see functionality somehow through movement when I'm looking into that space. So that's one of the interfaces or thresholds. And the other one, I wanted to say something about sensing and making sense. And speak a little bit about dance in relation to this term sense. Because dance a lot of times is quite connected to sense as in sensing. It could be both terms of feeling, more like emotional sensing, let's say. But also a lot of time dance is connected to sensuality or sensitivity or sensibility. So sense appears in that way. But it's usually presented as a kind of a opposite of making sense. Like it's more of an abstraction, something that could be hard to understand, or that is what words cannot say. A lot of times dance is somehow asked to say things that words cannot say. So there is a little bit of a paradox there, like that it's so connected to some understandings of sense, but not so much to others. And I'm collaborating in this research project with a philosopher, a Swedish philosopher called Sven-Olof Wallenstein, and who is writing on a project that he titles Sense and Sensibility, just like the novel from Jane Austen. So usually they are presented as opposites, right? So when you're trying to make sense of something, you're moving away from the sense, your sensitive or sensible appearing of something. But that is questioned in this aesthetic experience. So when you're, Sven-Olof has this phrase that he used, saying something that is just beneath the threshold of articulation. I think that's also why this interface and exchange with the term threshold. So something that is sort of about to be articulated, but not quite articulated. I'm sure you've had this experience lots of times when you're trying to explain something. It's like you're finding your words as you go along. And also the experience that something makes perfectly sense to you, but you can't really make sense of it. Like you can't really explain why, but it just works. And I think a lot of times spatial experience is like that when you're trying to decide where to put your sofa at home or something. It's like there is a place where it feels right. it makes sense to you that it's in that place and not another place, but you maybe can't really articulate for yourself why that is. So that's sort of aesthetic sense making, which is different from a, let's say, logic that maybe would be like what you can explain. And maybe you will find explanations, you know, you could say, well, it's like because of the door or that painting that is there, but at the same time, you don't really know. Like, it also becomes like a kind of after construction, no? Like explaining things, but it came already from somewhere else. And then you try to figure out why it was like that. So when we're engaging in these site-specific works, it's to see how it makes sense to us, but not necessarily trying to make sense as understandable for a visiting audience, or maybe even to ourselves. I've got in contact now with a researcher at the architect school in Copenhagen, and he's working with this phenomena, or French term, that is called terrain vague, so meaning like a vague terrain. And usually it's used for when there is like an empty lot between two houses, like something that hasn't yet found a function, and it's there as a vague terrain. So to move into a site using it as a vague terrain, like not trying to almost consciously approach it with this vagueness. So not vague in the sense, I don't know what this is, but sort of deliberately staying in something that is beneath the threshold of articulation. So this is somehow the project of this research pilot, to move into these spaces. And we're discussing a little bit, I'm collaborating again with this research group, the SWARM that I mentioned, to see what kind of places it is that we could inhabit in the described way. And at the same time, I have these two collaborators, on one hand with Sven-Olof Wallenstein, and the other one is Birgitta Burling, who's a visual artist who has worked a lot with the concept of haptics. So what a haptic space is. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, and it's quite a complicated term. I heard a nice explanation once, is that saying like, as if your eye would be poking things. So it's like some kind of sense that is in between optical or visual and tactile. So that we can make a little experiment here. You can just look around a little bit instead of watching me on the screen, and look at a couple of items or things in your room or wherever you are situated. And you can notice that if you imagine how it would feel to put your mouth up against that object, you can already sense what it would feel like. So there's like a sensuous experience of the space. So I guess because early in our life, the first thing we did was starting to put stuff in our mouth. You know, I'm sure you've seen infants. That's like it's a function also, like it's one of the early meridians that is developed through the body. It has this connection from the thumb and to the mouth and to the other. So why we put the thumb in our mouth is also like a kind of physical reflex in our body, but it also means that we can take things and put them in our mouth. So it's just like getting all that information into the body. So now you don't need anymore to feel what the glass feels like if you put it in your mouth, because you've done it enough times so that just by looking at it, you can somehow mimic that sensation to yourself. So if you're looking at the space around you in that way, it becomes alive, no, in a different sense. It becomes tactile almost, instead of just a screen or a visual, rendering. So that could be an explanation of this haptic sensation. So Birgitta, for example, when she was teaching at the architect school here in Stockholm, and we've been collaborating a bit there, she would take students out to a site and they would make these haptic mappings of a site. So not just like a coordinate, spatial coordinates of, like that you would see on a map usually, but maybe more like how things feel in that place. So what's your physical experience? What is it that you sense when you walk into that space, rather than how many meters is this from here to there? so less of a geometrical relation to space and more of a sensuous relation to space. So Birgitta will be helping us in with these tools of haptic mapping in the sites that we'll eventually engage with. So this is the outset of the project. I think I have a couple of more references that I wanted to say something about, because they somehow link a little bit to things I'm talking about, and maybe if someone would be interested in following up. So just 3 books here that I wanted to mention, and they all have quite different approaches to this topic. So the first one is On Having No Head by Douglas Harding. And it's, like I said beneath here, it says on the radical and empirical and personal experience of not sensing the head. And this is more of a venture into meditation and the sort of physical sensations of meditating. And what happened to the author there was a kind of insight of not being able to feel the head. So a lot of times we are experiencing ourselves. When I said this, like we place ourselves in space somewhere, and a lot of times we have a feeling that we are in here somewhere, experiencing ourselves from behind our face. So in the head. But then what he felt like that, because you're experiencing, that's the place you cannot see. Like I can watch myself in the screen, but or in a mirror, but when I'm looking around, the face is the place that's kind of a blank to me. I can't look at my own head. I can turn around and look at the back or the rest of the butt, but there's like a blind spot there. So all of a sudden it gave him this feeling of like, there is no head. And in the book, there's a beautiful passage when he says, when I looked for myself, I saw the world. Because since I'm experiencing the world from here, then when I look at that, it's like I just see what's out there. So it's quite similar to this outward and out, like this reflection of a camouflage, like somehow like when I try to go in, I just see what's out there. Another one is Mind in Motion, How Action Shapes Thought, and it's by Barbara Tversky. And it's on spatial thinking. So how we need the body and the space to think, or how it supports us in our thinking. And they're presenting some really interesting studies. For example, giving people directions through an instruction, and then asking them to be able to repeat those instructions so that they can help someone else finding something. And then with one test group, they did not allow them to move their hands. So they had to sit on their hands while they got their instructions, and then see if they could just sort of purely by memory remember. And then the other ones could, while they were listening to it or reading it, they could sort of place like, okay, so I go there and then I go to the right, and then if I further, and so they could move while, and then they integrated the information much better. So it was their movement, their own movement, that helped them to remember it. So how, by sort of placing things, and I'm sure maybe you've heard about these memory techniques that the people that practice, they would take a very familiar street, for example, and then they would place the items that they should remember in these places that they already know. So there's a kind of, this goes here, that's there, like there is already a map somehow where they can put the information in. And then the last one I wanted to mention is The Ego Tunnel by Thomas Metzinger. And the ego tunnel refers to how one is always restricted to oneself, and it's also research on outer body experience. So when I mentioned this, that we are rendering the world back to ourselves, that could be quite a nice image of this ego tunnel. That everything I look at is something that I produced myself as an image for myself. And I'm not able to look at anything from any other place than that. I cannot exit this ego tunnel. And when they're looking at this outer body experiences, they're also looking at it as very times quite similar. So it happens mostly in the same way. People exit their body through the same way. like no one sort of sneaks out through the armpit, for example, but usually it's an experience of going out from here. And so they're saying that there's a kind of that's a kind of a glitch in the system, that all of a sudden this situatedness of experiencing oneself inside the body is sort of moved, and all of a sudden you're experiencing yourself from a different place than in your body. So anyway, all these are kind of different approaches to that relation between body and space. All right, so I think I've been through the whole project, everything I wanted to reference for you and tell you about what we're planning to work on, because I said it's a pilot project and we're just moving into it now. I'm just getting started, and the idea is then that it would lead to a larger research project in the future from these initial ideas. So with that, I think I would just thank you all for your attention. I'll stop sharing as well. And I'd be very happy to hear any of your thoughts or reflections or questions if there are anything that wasn't clear or anything else you're wondering about.
Thank you so much, Rasmus, for this so illuminating presentation. I don't want to speak for, I'll just speak for myself. You brought me to a really different level of perceiving everyday things that, especially this haptic room, this haptic perspective. I know that I'm so oral in my life in general, but I was that ability to be able to taste and all of these different objects completely shifts my perception of what I'm doing. I wanted to, something you were speaking about with visual perceptions and between two people looking at this, I'm paraphrasing and perhaps this is not where you were going, but this ability for two people to have completely different perceptions of an object that's in front of them. I have to tell you that this was so much part of, I've been following the horrific trial of this Derek Chauvin, the police officer who was convicted of murder of George Floyd. And one of the, in a very practical sense to bring this up, this relates so much to the real perception of how visualization was such a critical part of this trial and how different the prosecution against Derek Chauvin was presenting and the perception of the defense. I mean, they were looking absolutely the same images and this complete 180 degrees difference, which has so much rooted in political gesture, etc., in history. But that was really affecting me, how you were speaking about that. Those were the two really very, very impactful things I'm coming away from this, plus these remarkable resources. So I thank you, because I think these issues you present are actually part of, so much clearly part of our everyday moment. And to be able to think different perception is so important in our time. So it wasn't a question, it was just a reaction. Oh, and one more thing on that mnemonic, the physicality, the mnemonic thing. I don't want to turn this into me, but I have this quiet side career as a film actor, and I've been featured in this quite horrendous horror movie. And I had this long monologue, and I've never had to memorize lines. As a musician, of course, memorizing scores. But it was only through attaching the actual line to the gesture that I was able to remember that in such a quick manner. I don't know if that relates to, that would have been the book Mind in Motion, Tversky. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And just to add there too, when I think the example there of the trial is also an extreme case, because it's such a shocking experience, such a traumatic experience for everyone involved. So it's not just like the everyday difference, but when you go into these, when you're witnessing something traumatic, it's also some completely other systems that kick in, deep systems of denial, or all these what's it called, the fight
or flight, yes.
So how you're responding to that in such an extreme case, and I think these trials are they really highlight that. But like you're saying, it's also something that's happening constantly. It's just that it doesn't. We're closer enough to agreement to what's going on, and there's not we don't need a jury to finalize a certain result of it. But under the radar, these differences are taking place all the time.
Yep.
And in art, of course, when you're discussing a piece of art that you've seen, how people experience it, and you can read the critique of the same piece from two different people, and they just seem, it's like it doesn't sound like they saw the same play or saw the same painting.
For sure. Please, from our global audience, we have guests.
Yeah, Gerhard, I see you there.
Yeah, hello. I am Gerhard Lock from Tallinn University, Estonia. So I wanted to say just that I very much resonate with everything you expressed. I'm a I'm composer and musicologist, so I have thought in similar directions also from the musical point of view. So it's hard to express it now in fast. I try to find some resources as well, but I would be interested to get to know more. And you said you just started this research. Would there be a chance to be involved maybe?
Sure, let's stay in contact. Like I said, I have a pilot version in place, and let's see where it's taking. So we can stay in touch. I can even just write my email here in the chat so that you don't have to look for it. And of course, for all of you, if there's anyone else who prefers asking a question or coming with some thoughts.
Rasmus, thank you so much. I was very appreciate so much to this kind of reflection about the dance and space and body. Thank you from Spain, from University Catholic San Antonio of Murcia. Thank you, Rasmus.
Thank you, Sebastian. Maybe I can just add a short reflection there, Gerhard, also in relation to music and sound. Of course, acoustics is the most obvious place. No, like you also know how important it is when you're playing an instrument in one place or another place. Like the experience of that sound is completely dependent on the place where you're experiencing it. So you cannot separate the music playing from the space where it's happening. So this extension of the instrument into the space and then back to the perceiver, both of an audience member, but also to the one who's playing, right? Like if you're playing and you're listening to what you're playing in the space, it creates quite a different experience. I remember having some voice classes where they were studying this difference between like really listening to how you sound in the space, which also becomes a kind of the subjective experience dissolves a little bit between like I'm both listening to the sound that I'm also producing myself. So I would say it's very close to that interface there between the I said moving and being moved, right? So this thing of like both producing the sound and listening to the sound somehow.
I have a quick question because I understand this is the focus is the research. So the opportunities for presenting this, will this be presented in a public forum? I don't, it doesn't seem you're not making a piece. This is not a lights, action, camera, but this is really the focus on the deep research. But would the goal be to have some kind of public presentation, or what do you see being able to disseminate the final, whatever the research leads you to?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point because when it comes to artistic research, no, like, and it exists as well in other research. You know, when we're talking about sort of applied research, for example, or you have a a company who has a R&D department, research and development partner, and because they're interested in developing some feature of the device that they are producing, and then they will invest in research. No, but it's really in order to optimize this product that they're selling. And in this artistic research, it's not that in that way that I'm trying to optimize a product that I'm selling, but it's more of a what do you call basic research, no? Like investigating these phenomena from the point of view of a dancer and a choreographer. So to assume that there is some kind of perspective, this choreographic perspective, or maybe some kind of also dance embodied perspective to a space that can allow for some specific knowledge to appear, and then how to share those outcomes. We're a little bit discussing different possibilities here of whether, like the examples that I showed you from Uppsala, they were all performances in a specific place, and it was a commission. We were invited to use that place, and now we're thinking about like maybe just ourselves choosing places and just to investigate them on our own and document this. Also because it's a pilot project, so to not like to also have some time in the workshop, so to speak, before presenting something, and so that this filter or layer of performance and the having an eye on you, which of course also affects you differently, makes you that space, whatever space you're in, is also very transformed by an audience, right? Playing in an empty theater, as some of us have had to do during the last year, is quite a different experience than having, even if it's just a handful of people in there. So to not necessarily need to deal with that public aspect at the same time. So we're not quite sure yet.
Yeah. I when I use the word love, I don't mean love, but I find this working method is so critically important in the arena of the arts, and it's not so often to have this opportunity. And I loved how you talked about the R&D of a company. Why shouldn't an artist have that R&D possibility without that goal perception of this is going to be a performative work? So you're a lot of light bulbs are going off about the CAPE network for our application next year, about laboratories that we could perhaps, in a laboratory sensibility versus a formal workshop situation. So we're coming to the end. Any other comments, questions? Rasmus has been so gracious sharing his email with us, and just I think this is just a really important, illuminating way to end this spring. I am so thankful that we've had this opportunity to have Rasmus with us to really make us think, which is something we need to do now. So I just conclude by saying bravo. Thank you so much, and thank you for being part of our network.
My pleasure. Once again, thanks for the attention and the invitation.
And you will be receiving the YouTube documentation of this. Thank you, everybody. Have a good, safe, and healthy rest of the spring and a summer we all deserve. And hopefully, we still have the possibilities next year to bring us all physically together. So let's hope we can have that opportunity. Thank you again, Rasmus. Everybody have a great afternoon. Bye now.